Okay, we talked about having the history of aviation and whether it's important or not important. And a lot of things you can learn from the history of aviation that will be applicable in your future lives. So my suggestion is that while you should not have to remember really specific details about early aviation, there are some key times when you ought to remember events that have happened. For example, does anybody remember what happened in July of 1969? I'm sorry, what? You don't have those earbuds in your ear, do you, Humberto? Put the earbuds up here and your phone on the table. Anybody else want to play around with earbuds and a phone? And I don't think it's funny. I think it's stupid. Knowing a long time ago at the beginning of this course that earbuds and phones weren't allowed, and for somebody to continue to do that doesn't strike me as being really highly bright. And if that kind of talk doesn't appeal to you at all, you have an option. Way back in the classical period in Greek mythology, there was a mythology, a myth probably, about Greek gods, but the Greeks believed in it. And there were two characters called Daedalus and Icarus. And you may have heard the story about their attempting to fly. So they built wings out of feathers and wax, using the wax to keep the feathers together so that they could use it as a wing. And sure enough, they went flying. And Icarus' father, Daedalus, said, "Now be sure you don't go too near the sun, otherwise the wax is going to melt." And just like children tend to do, ignored his father, went too near the sun melted the wax, Icarus came crashing down dead. So these are early stories that demonstrate that people were very much interested in aviation, in flight, trying to figure out how people could get up in the air like the birds. I'm sure several thousand years went by and humans continue to look up and watch birds fly overhead and wonder how in the world or when they would ever be able to get up in the air with the birds. In the classical period, considered the classical period, everybody must be aware by now of Archimedes. He had a lot to do with things like the battleship Missouri, as huge as it is, floating in the water and not sinking. So with his idea of buoyancy, we come upon a man by the name of Leonardo da Vinci. And in Italian, that means Leonard from Vinci. I've been to Vinci. It's a small little village on top of a hill. And there's nothing unusual about it. It just happens to be a little Italian village with a small little courtyard where I found the people not terribly friendly, but they were nice, not overly so. So Leonardo da Vinci, you'll hear that time and time again because he's drawn many things. He's done paintings. He's done drawings of all kinds of things. There are museums filled with models he drew or built and people have reconstructed from his drawings, and he clearly was, I would say for his time, he was probably, even though Einstein changed the way we think about our lives and about the atomic era, I still think Leonardo da Vinci was way beyond life. So he developed helicopters, he developed that machine there happens to be a screwing type machine that we thought probably would fly better than the helicopter he designed. That's a picture of him in the center. Archimedes, that's at least somebody's representation of Archimedes. It's probably pretty good because in those days the only way that you could take a picture was to carve it in stone or have it last, carve it in wax or carve it in clay, none of which would persevere except stone. And even stone tended to deteriorate over time. That's the reason people went to bronze. And then remember the word called the Bronze Age was a time when people discovered how to make bronze. And as a result, they cast things in bronze that, for example, there were statues that were dumped in the Atlantic Ocean 5,000 years ago and that are still intact. And they plucked them out of the ocean and they're in museums now, but they've been in the salt water for 5,000 years. See, that's pretty remarkable for something like a piece of metal. Even though an iron bar thrown into the ocean, even within 100 years, would be completely gone. It would have gone to rust and then would have drifted away. So in something called the Renaissance, if you ever hear somebody say something about another person saying, well, he or she is a Renaissance man or woman, it means that you're capable of doing a lot of different things over a broad spectrum. And he used paper bags, and you're going to find later on, and we'll cover that shortly now, you'll find it later on, other people did too, but his was the first one where he took a bag, turned it upside down over a flame, and it started going up. He designed an ornithopter. Remember, we had that question on one of our quizzes some time ago about an ornithopter, where somebody believed, was it Cayley? Remember George Cayley? Who believed that an ornithopter was probably going to be the future of aviation. Didn't turn out to be that way, but at least I think it was George. Does anybody remember exactly who it was that felt that the ornithopter was going to be the aircraft of the future? Okay, I did. Pardon? The guy from England. That was Cayley, but I don't remember whether it was Cayley or someone else. Does anybody else remember? I don't happen to remember. Pardon? Okay, well, at this point in time, we'll continue on here. So, with the exception of all of the great designs put out by Leonardo da Vinci, Leonard of Vinci, it turns out that the idea of human flight first took place in a balloon. And the Montgolfier, it's a French name, and it's pronounced Montgolfier, not fear or fire. Montgolfier. Those brothers were the ones that, first of all, designed balloons, and they did so the same way that Leonardo did. They were experimenting with bags over flames, and for a long time they thought that the smoke was the reason for the bags rising. So they did everything they could to make more smoke. They put a lot of straw on the fire. They put rubberized stuff on the fire, anything they could to create smoke, because they believed that smoke was the ingredient that caused the buoyancy. We know that's not true, but at the time they thought so. By the way, Francisco de Lana, he thought the idea he had was make 3 or 4 copper spheres exhausted of air, so they had nothing inside them. And he believed that if you attached them to a ship, the ship would rise over the ocean. Does that seem reasonable? Doesn't to me either. It seems to me that the weight of the copper alone would cause it to overcome any buoyancy that might be given by a vacuum. I'm not even sure it would a vacuum rise, would it? If you took something and you took the air out of it, would it get lighter? I'm not sure. And if it would, by how much? I don't know. One of these days maybe I'll try to test that, but right now we don't have that money in the budget. Okay, so the Montgolfier brothers are the real establishment of human flight, because not only did they leave the earth first, but they also left it with animals, and then they left it with humans. So animals and humans went aloft in the air first because of the Montgolfier brothers. And where were they from? Do you remember? France, right. And that's one of the many reasons why the French continue to believe that they are the seat of aviation, contrary to Kitty Hawk and the Wright brothers. I'm sure that they have been upset for the last 100 years or more because we continue to claim that the birthplace of aviation was in Kitty Hawk. Well, it really wasn't. Their background is they were worth a lot of money, so their parents had developed multiple paper mills, and all the paper mills were on pretty fast-roaring rivers that provided the necessary energy to be able to make paper. Actually, at some point in time, they actually owned more than 2 paper mills. I believe the number was something around a half a dozen or more. But that's beside the point. That's not something that you have to remember. In all of these lectures in history of aviation, you must be able to pick out the key items that you think are important. But what else is your option? Your option is to raise your hand and say, Mr. Gallagher, is this one of those key items you were referring to? And I will either say yes or no. Because in all of the history that we're going to explain to you, only some of it is really worth memorizing. They were the first ones to experiment with hydrogen. They were able to, first of all, discover how to make hydrogen. Somebody did. I don't think it was the Montgolfier brothers, but I think it was someone in France. Pardon? A physicist, okay. In France. And he did it with multiple chemicals, didn't he? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. And then they discovered it was a little too expensive. Besides which, hydrogen is one of those things where... Sure. Has anybody ever inhaled helium and then tried to talk? Okay, well, one of the downsides of hydrogen is that if you inhale hydrogen and try to talk, it doesn't make you sound like Donald Duck. But, oh, wait a minute now. Does anybody know who Donald Duck is? You do, huh? Okay. And you know what he sounds like. And that's what you sound like when you inhale helium and begin to talk by exhaling helium, because helium shrinks up your vocal cords. So if you get a chance to get a helium balloon, Eric, what was that? So if you get a chance someday to take a helium balloon, maybe somebody gives you one for your birthday, open it up and inhale the helium, and then try to talk. So the Montgolfier brothers finally decided they were going to build a nice large balloon, and it was made out of linen and paper on the inside. And one of the things they also found out was the fact that eventually they had to dissolve rubber in turpentine. And by dissolving rubber in turpentine and then spreading it over the surface of the balloon, it would prevent either water from coming in or hydrogen or hot air from getting out. But their experiment turned out to be quite well done because it went to 3,000 feet. When it got there, it came back down, it crashed and burned. But from their point of view and from the point of view of all the investors from that point on, it was a most successful flight. And pay particular attention to the date. One of the things, a key item in these presentations are the dates, but particularly the year in which aviation began. 1783. There were a number of things that occurred in 1783, not just Montgolfier, but subsequent to Montgolfier, there were competitors who jumped in. Remember that one question I had on the exam? Good ideas usually generate what? They usually generate competition, correct? And so what happened in 1783 is there were probably a dozen or more people who decided that they could do better than Montgolfier, and they started building balloons as well. But because Montgolfier brothers were first, and because they were able to build a balloon that went to 3,000 feet, they were able to get a lot of additional money from investors who wanted to get in on this brand new field of aviation. In addition to investors who were quite willing to put up money, they got government support because France wanted to be known as the seat of aviation. And it's a title which really does still belong to France, because all of the major activities that went on in the early days of aviation occurred in France. J.A.C. Charles was one of the people who also got very, very competitive with the Montgolfier brothers. And he's the guy that designed a balloon. In his particular case, it was silk with rubber dissolved in turpentine. Some of the key things to remember here are Montgolfier and Charles. They were both there at the right time. They had the right ideas. They came up with the right balloons. They were successful in what they did. So if you want to put a little asterisk next to the name Montgolfier and Charles, I would do so. And especially circle 1783, because I guarantee you that that's a number you're going to want to remember for a long time to come, because it is the beginning of aviation. Sure. And this was all going on in 1 year, 1783. Pretty amazing to me. But then when you look at the history of aviation from 1783 until 1969, when we landed on the moon, that time, geologically speaking, is just a breath. It's a flash of a second, maybe. Less than that, probably. How rapidly from 1783 to 1903 with the Wright brothers to 1969 landing on the moon. That time is so compressed and so rapid. Even though I was there when they landed on the moon, none of you were. So you can appreciate that just in someone's lifetime, these miraculous things can take place. And in my opinion, they were miraculous. You all ready? Okay. another form of competition. It was Charles' balloon called Charlier, and his was 12 feet. As you can see, it went up to 1,500 feet before it disappeared in the clouds. It burst and crashed, but still, anytime anyone could get a balloon to go up that high, you can imagine what the balloon looked like when it got that high. If it was only 12 feet in diameter, it was probably a little tiny dot in the sky. That was enough to convince everyone that ballooning and aviation were here to stay. So it's likely that a lot of you might be thinking that all the new ideas, all the great inventions in aviation have all been done. And you can't imagine how many sincere scientists, philosophers, people in general have said that over the centuries. Somebody has said something back in the 1800s about the field of physics has been already filled. There's nothing more to discover. Just time and time again, people have underestimated the power of humans to continue to discover and come up with new inventions. Again, it's the process of how did they arrive at a balloon that could carry animals. I guess one of the thoughts was that if it happens that the rooster jumps out of the balloon when it's up in the air, will the rooster survive by flapping his wings on the way down? And I don't know the answer to that. The duck as well. The duck might have survived, right? The duck could fly a lot better than the rooster can. So maybe it was the duck. The unfortunate sheep, though, that's another thing. So you can see that not only was ballooning an interest by investors, it was an interest in the government as well, but it was also an interest of people like the Academy of Science. We have academies of science in almost every major nation in the world. Here in this country, we have a very, very significant Academy of Science, very significant, populated by extremely bright, well-established people who have either inventions or ideas to their name. Matthew. That one, it went to 1,500, right? Didn't we just say that? Went to 1,500 before disappearing. So the Montgolfier brothers are going to get the credit for the very first manned flight ever. And if anybody wants to argue about who was first in aviation, that would be a tough one to overcome. Yes, they did not have a glider like the Wright brothers. They did not have a powered aircraft like the Wright brothers, but they were able to lift people off the surface of the earth and bring them back down safely. This was the fourth balloon, and it's important because it was the first one to carry a human. And it was much larger than anything that had been up to that time, 46 feet in diameter. And yes, it was tethered, but it still rose up to the high point of the tether. Tethered means that it had ropes attached to it, so it couldn't go any higher. It was kept at a certain level. So is this a key slide? Yes, it is. The first manned flight ever. And still in 1783. Even though there has been competition, there have been others who have built and flown balloons. The Montgolfier brothers have been the first to put animals up, and then secondly to put up people and bring them back down safely. Further competition happened to be a free flight. This time it was going to be untethered, so it was going to be allowed to float free. And the king was involved at the time because the king helped fund the balloon. And the people who were involved in the ballooning, Rosier and Darlande, the two people who were involved, they wanted to go up in the balloon. The king said, "Oh, no. No such luck. You're not going up in that balloon. If it crashes, look who we've lost. We've lost the edge of manned flight against Montgolfier." So they picked a bunch of criminals and they said to them, "Okay, if you want to go up in that balloon, if you survive, your sentence is commuted and you're a free person. If you don't survive, tough. But you have the opportunity to get free if you're willing to go up in that balloon that is not tethered to the earth." And so the balloon went up for 25 minutes, which was at that time longer than any manned balloon had ever been in the air. And it drifted out of Paris, 5 miles beyond Paris, before it finally came down, before it finally landed. Down. Well, keep in mind, what are the disadvantages of a hot air balloon? It gets cold, right? The higher it goes, the colder the air. The surrounding air is ultimately going to work its way into the balloon somehow, and the balloon is going to ultimately come back down on its own. Pardon? How come the other what? Oh, well, I have no idea what caught them on fire, you know. Remember, they were trying to heat them with piles of wood. So I have no background on exactly what would cause those balloons to crash and burn. I don't know. I could see them crashing just because the hot air gets cold. But when they get to the ground, what causes them to get on fire, I don't know. Here are another couple of people, the Robert brothers, who worked on J.A.C. Charles' design. They were able to improve gas collection. That is, that one of the problems was they didn't have a good way to gather the gas together and get it into the balloon from its source without losing a lot of it. Again, hydrogen development in the 1783, still in that famous year. And if any of you ever miss a question that asks, when did manned flight begin? When did flight begin? When did aviation begin? And you're not able to say 1783, I'd be very disappointed. This one, you can take a look and see that not only did it go higher than any balloon has ever gone, but it flew farther than any balloon. So just in a span of 12 months, there was a lot of frenzied activity to build balloons with new and better material and to use better methods of heating the air or of filling it with hydrogen. And again, 9,000 feet, even a balloon of 26 feet in diameter at 9,000 feet, are you going to see it? Probably not. I mean, if you do, you're probably going to see just a reflection of the sun off the balloon, but not much else. In our flying gliders, when we're circling in thermals at 9,000 or 10,000 feet, it's impossible to see it unless the sun flashes a reflection off the wings of the glider. Otherwise, we can't see it. So you know that was an enormous accomplishment on the part of the Robert brothers to be able to build a balloon and fly it 17 miles and at 9,000 feet, and then it came back down again successfully. And I don't know how long it takes. I guess it depends on the material that you use to build a balloon, how long it would take the cold air aloft to seep into the balloon in some way. But I want to tell you about flying gliders. You remember we talked about that, and why does a glider fly? Why do thermals develop? It's because there's at least a small difference in temperature between the heat of the air near the ground and what we call ambient air. Does everybody know what the word ambient air means? Ambient air is that air. If you jump up 10 feet, you're in ambient air. You stand down here, you're in ambient air. Ambient air is air surrounding all of us. Ambient air. So ambient air has a temperature that decreases with altitude. And with that in mind, if you can heat the ground enough with the sun, you're going to generate hot air that touches the ground, and it's going to start rising. And that's how we generate thermals for lift in gliders. Pardon? No. But I might ask you the question in class one of these days about this individual, because what's important about Mr. Charles? He was very, very deeply involved in the competition, wasn't he? Sure. Very much so. Remember earlier I said, remember two names. Montgolfier and Charles, right? This is what was beginning to get people excited about the fact that maybe aviation was here to stay. At that time, other than Leonardo da Vinci, not too many people had enough foresight to think ahead and decide that maybe aviation was going to be a lot more than just going up in a balloon. Okay, so that finishes this particular part of the course. Are there any questions about what to study or what to remember when it comes to history of aviation? We're going to have these kinds of lectures from now till December. And we're going to have quizzes, not every day. We're going to have a quiz every Monday. And it's going to be on the material that we covered in the previous week. And I'm going to help you remember the key things that you need to remember and need to make notes of, so that when it comes time for a quiz, even with your open notes, you'll be able to do much, much better. I think by now, having taken so many pages of notes, in fact, there were something like 27 lectures in our class called The Introduction to Aviation, and you took 27 sets of notes, and you answered about 30 quizzes, as I can recall. 3 a week for 10 weeks, let's say 27 quizzes. So by now you should be experts in taking quizzes and taking good notes, hopefully. So are there any questions about Mr. Montgolfier or the Montgolfier brothers and Charles and the way the balloons were constructed? And what was the downside of hydrogen? What did they finally go to? Hot air. Heated how? The Montgolfiers thought it was the smoke. It wasn't. It was just the heat. They quickly discovered that it was just the heat, not the smoke. But what else? Jesus, what are your thoughts? On what? Well, on a bathtub maybe, or... You realize that we're in a history of aviation class? Okay, good. So if I ask you the question, what are your thoughts? Are you going to tell me about bathtubs? Okay. What are your thoughts about history of aviation, Jesus?
Well, I'll have a question was that how come the hydrogen development one that AJ and Robert did, how come it says that?
How come it says what?
It says like put on the last one that never flew again.
Well, let me ask you this: do you remember the flight around the world with Janet Yeager and Dick Rutan? What were they flying? Do you remember the name of the plane? The Voyager, right? And that flew, right? How many times did it fly? Once. Where did it wind up? Air and Space Museum in Washington, right? So generally, when there are kind of one of a kind things, like the Bell X-1 that Yeager broke the sound barrier, where is that hanging? And how many times did it fly? Once, right? So generally, even in car racing or aviation or other forms of life's endeavors, when somebody sets an amazing record, done for the first time, usually they're willing to put that somewhere as a memoir of the fact that they achieved that. So in this particular case, I'm sure that if that balloon isn't in one of the museums in Paris, I'd be very surprised. It's just like we talked about longitude and about the man who invented the clock, the chronometer, that allowed the English to determine longitude. You realize how difficult that was? Let me explain that. You put a clock on a ship, right? Now the ship is sailing, but it's going through heat and cold, damp and dry, and all of the forms of weather. And in a clock, this is one of the big problems they had, in a clock, if the clock is not built right, it'll get way off because the pieces inside the clock expand or contract at different rates. So the man who invented the chronometer that solved the problem of longitude, every piece in that clock and that chronometer was designed so that if one piece expanded, the one that was connected to it would contract. And the entire chronometer was designed that way. To me, that whole idea is so mind-boggling that this man could come up with a device that would never get off by more than a couple of seconds on a 3 or 4 month voyage. And that's the way they solved the problem of longitude, and that's how he wound up eventually getting the 10 or 20 or 30 million dollars, whatever the prize was in monies today. I don't remember, but those are the kind of inventions. And that particular chronometer, by the way, even though it was tested on a ship, it never sailed on a regular basis. It wound up in the National Maritime Museum in London. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and come back, and we'll have a class on remote drones. What do you need? Pardon? What is that?
When are we going to work on those planes again?
Oh, on Friday. Yeah.
What we did yesterday? I was at a water polo game.
Do you have an excused absence from yesterday?
The school ship cleared automatically.
Huh?
My school ship cleared automatically for water polo.
You were in water polo, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, what did we do yesterday? Well, we talked a little bit about things. And did you get? Okay, you got that. That's fine. We covered a lot about the fact that the essay, your first essay topic, is due on Friday. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, pay attention. Your topic is due on Friday. It cannot be the same as any topic anyone chose in the previous course, Introduction to Aviation. I still have the list of everybody that signed up and told me what their topic was. And I pointed out that there are thousands upon thousands of topics in the world of aviation that you can choose. So don't even think about trying to match up with anything anybody else has done. So you need to come up with a topic. And Where?
Cafeteria.
Okay, you need to be back here at 2:20.
We just need the topic and then the 5 paragraphs, the 5 topics.
You turn in the topic on Friday, and I would suggest you come in with an alternate, because if somebody already has that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a little lottery. I'm going to have your name in a cup, and I'm going to have somebody draw names out of there so that you can put down your topic first. And then anybody that follows that is going to either have to match it, you're going to have to do, if they had that and same thing in mind, they're going to have to come up with their alternate. Okay. So Friday, with the topic, come out with at least 1 or 2 alternates that do not in any way match what was done in the previous quarter of the semester. Okay. Andrew, can you what? A who? The Luftwaffe? Was it a topic before? You'll have to come in on Friday with your ideas. We'll do a lottery. In fact, if I were you, I wouldn't have said a word, because now somebody's going to say, well, if I win the lottery, if I'm higher in the lottery than Andrew, I'm going to take Luftwaffe. All right? Yeah, sure, you can do that. It's an aviation group, but not a very good one. But that's okay. Sal. Montgolfier, what about him?
Did they survive the transformation, or did they get their head chopped off?
I don't know what happened to them. I don't think they just disappeared, but I just don't know what happened to them for sure. Hey, Raziel, you going outside? No. Pardon? Come back in here. How many times have I told everyone in this class, you can't walk out of here unless you ask me and tell me where you're going? So you're just going to walk out, right? Oh, for God. Come on. Come on. Do you play football?
Yeah.
And do they have plays on the field?
Yeah.
And somebody tells you the play, then you forget the play and they run over you? Huh? But you remember the plays. Oh. But now you forgot that you were supposed to check in with me to go to the cafeteria, right? You got to be back here by 2:20. Anybody else need to go? Who, Andrew? Why, because the defense is on the field all the time? Huh? Oh, but how about Andrew? Is he? Oh. What is he play tackle or what? Oh, he plays guard and you're a tackle? Okay.